I turned back to the shop at 8 p.m. to retrieve the watch I had forgotten, only to overhear my son-in-law talking to my eldest daughter on speakerphone. This shop, 1.1 million. The house, 680,000. We will move them both to a nursing home. Use mom's diagnosis to get the power of attorney POA. Dad will sign it. He trusts us. They intended to sell everything I owned without telling me, and discard both my wife and me into a nursing home. I stood there for 3 full minutes, calmly walked back to my truck, and began planning to expose it all. 3 weeks later, they showed up, and their keys no longer worked. I'm grateful you chose to spend this time here. Before the story starts, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, city, country, wherever you are, I want to know. Note this story includes fictional elements built for education and reflection. Any resemblance to existing names or locations is unintentional, but what it teaches, I believe, is something worth carrying with you. The last ordinary Tuesday of my life looked exactly like every other one before it. That's the part I keep coming back to. I turned off Main Street into the lot at Briggs & Co. Just before 4 in the afternoon, third space from the entrance, same one I've used since 1997. Autumn was pulling the light down early the way it does in the Pacific Northwest, and the shop window held the last of it gold on glass, the way it always does in October. I sat in the truck for exactly the amount of time it took to notice I was sitting in it, then went in. Another Tuesday. I wasn't looking for anything unusual. I had no reason to. I opened Briggs & Company timepieces in September of 1990. 33 years old, 2-year lease I could barely afford, and considerably more confidence than any bank on the Pacific Coast thought I'd earned. The display cases along the front wall I built myself from walnut, measured twice, cut once. No room for error on a thin budget. The floor tiles, 1997. The ceiling I refinished in 2008. The grandfather clock against the back wall, a Hamburg long case, circa 1881. Technically on long-term consignment from a Portland estate that never quite resolved itself. I've wound it every Tuesday since 1992. Not because it belongs to me, because some things need to keep running whether anyone's watching or not. That principle I've since decided applies to more than clocks. The shop smelled exactly as it always has, machine oil cedar from the case interiors. Something faintly metallic I've never been able to name. 35 years of the same smell. My version of a church. And like any church, I suppose there's a certain faith involved in showing up, the belief that what you find inside will be exactly what it's always been. Eddie Walsh was behind the counter when I came in 22 years, with me 3 of them running daily operations since I stepped back from the grind. He knows this building the way most people only know their own homes in the dark, by feel without thinking. The Callaway watch in the back, I said. Ready for pickup tomorrow. Show cleaned, regulated case, polished. He set down the strap tool. Also case 4. The Patek Philippe Calatrava, the consignment piece. The bezel crystal is sitting a little loose. I noticed it this afternoon. I saw it last Tuesday, I said. We'll address it. 35 years of conversations like that. Short, precise, everything accounted for. I've always been a man who keeps his house in order. I thought I had the same handle on everything around me. Looking back now, I can see how much I had simply decided not to examine. I went to the back office. On the workbench where I'd left it the previous Tuesday, sat my father's pocket watch. A Hamilton from 1947, the movement seized solid from decades in a drawer. I'd brought it in, meaning to finally work on the mainspring. That was also what I'd told myself the Tuesday before and the one before that. 35 years of meaning to fix this watch. I picked it up, felt the crown hold firm against my thumb, and put it back in my jacket pocket. Tonight, maybe. I'd said that before. I drove home with the radio off. Dorothy would be doing her 6 p.m. exercises, the PT routine designed to maintain her fine motor coordination, which she approaches with the discipline of someone who has decided her body doesn't get a vote. The carbidopa levodopa I'd sorted into her weekly organizer on Sunday would be on the counter beside her water glass. That's a task I've never handed off, not once. She takes it every evening at the same time. That's the arrangement we made when she was first diagnosed, though we never put it into those words out loud. I thought about Noah, 8 years old, our grandson living with us going on 16 months. He'd be done with his homework by now. That's how he's built finish first, then the day is his. When I turned into the driveway on Ridgecrest Drive, the kitchen light was already on. Through the window, I could make out Dorothy at the table and Noah's colored pencils spread across the other half of it. He was bent over a school drawing with the focused concentration of someone who doesn't yet know how complicated things can get. I hung my jacket on the hook. "Victoria stopped by this morning," Dorothy said, not looking up from her book. "How long did she stay?" "Coffee and about an hour. She seemed fine." I stood at the refrigerator looking at nothing in particular, which is what I do when something's working through my head. Victoria had been stopping by more since Marcus died 16 months now. A rainy Tuesday in June, a stretch of highway that didn't forgive. 2 or 3 times a week lately, sometimes more. I figured she was lonely. That's what I told myself. That evening, I was simply a man glad his daughter had somewhere comfortable to be. I want to be clear about that. I had no reason at that moment to think anything different. After dinner, I went to the workshop and set the pocket watch under the examination lamp. The case was intact. The movement I knew without opening it was seized tight. 35 years of meaning to finish this. I looked at it for a minute and walked back inside without touching it. "I have to go back to the shop," I told Dorothy. "The Callaway watch is in the back for a morning pickup and I forgot it." "Go ahead," she said. "We're fine here." Noah was still at the table in his pajamas drawing. I put my jacket on and went out to the truck. The rain had started thin, October drizzle non-committal the Pacific Northwest, warming up to something more serious. Main Street was dark. 2 blocks out, I could already see the building. The front showroom was dark. Right. 8 o'clock on a Tuesday. That's how it should be. But through the front window, visible through the rain and the distance, the back office light was on. The one that should have been dark. I still don't know what I expected when I reached for that side door. I know I wasn't ready for what was waiting on the other side of it. I have walked through that shop at night more times than I can count. I know every sound it makes when it's empty, the low mechanical tick of the grandfather clock carrying into the front showroom, the slight give in the 3rd floorboard near the hallway entrance, the way the air settles differently after hours, cooler and stiller, without the movement of customers and conversation to keep it occupied. I know what silence sounds like in that building, which is how I knew before I reached the hallway that it wasn't silent. The side utility door is around the back corner. No signage, just a steel handle I installed in 1994 to handle supply deliveries without pulling them through the showroom. It opens onto a short service hallway that runs parallel to the back office. I pushed it open the way I always do after hours, carefully, without sound. 3 decades of habit. I heard the voices maybe 8 feet in. Not words, not yet just the rhythm of 2 people mid-conversation. One voice had room presence, the full warmth of someone standing in a space. The other had the slight flatness, the narrowed frequency range that you only get from a phone speaker. I stopped walking. I stood in the hallway. I recognized both voices before either of them finished a sentence. Glenn Mercer, my son-in-law. In my back office at 8:20 on a Tuesday evening. Victoria, my daughter. Calling in on speakerphone from her car somewhere outside, parked where no one passing on the street would easily notice it. I did not move. I am not entirely certain, in retrospect, that I breathed. Glenn's voice even and professional, 1.1 for the shop and building. Conservative, probably more. Victoria through the speaker and the house. Turks 680. Ridgecrest has been climbing. Could push 7. That's nearly 1.8. Against my position, a clean exit with room to spare. More than room. I stood there. His position. I knew what that phrase meant. Glenn had worked in commercial real estate for 15 years. His position meant debt, the kind of quiet financial weight a man carries without mentioning it at family dinners, the kind that begins reshaping decisions long before anyone around him realizes decisions are being made. Glenn's voice continued. It had the cadence of someone who had been over this before, not nervously but methodically, the way you work through a plan until the language for it becomes automatic. He was talking about a family meeting. End of October. He would frame it as a responsible safety measure, a sensible arrangement given Dorothy's condition. A power of attorney, the legal document that designates another person to make financial and property decisions on your behalf, typically used when someone can no longer manage their own affairs, would be prepared in advance. With Dorothy's condition, it's a natural ask, he said. He'll think it's just paperwork. Victoria, he'll sign it. He trusts us. Glenn, that's the whole point. I have heard a great many things said in that hallway. Repairmen, delivery drivers, 31 years of ordinary conversations. I had never stood in it the way I stood in it then, entirely still, no plan, nothing in my hands that mattered. Glenn mentioned Meadow Pines Senior Center on Route 7. He had already inquired. He had a brochure. December was the timeline he was working toward. He described it the way he'd describe a project milestone. A line on a schedule, something already half-organized in his head. Then Victoria and Caroline. She keeps asking to see Mom. A pause, longer than any of the others. Glenn, I'll handle Caroline. She won't be a problem. The conversation moved on, listing agent timing logistics. I don't know exactly how long I stood there after that sentence. Long enough for it to move from the hallway into something deeper, some part of the mind that files certain things away, not because you understand them yet, but because it knows they will matter. Then I heard it, the scrape of a chair against the hardwood floor weight, shifting the sounds of people about to leave. I moved. Back down the service hallway through the steel door, out into the narrow service alley that runs behind the building. I put my back against the brick and stood in the October rain without moving. A minute passed. Maybe two. The thin line of light I could see at a low angle under the back office door disappeared. Through the front showroom glass, two shapes moved in silhouette through the dark. The front door opened, closed. The car parked 40 yards down the block, well away from the main lot, not visible from the direction I always approach from, pulled out and drove away. I waited until it turned the corner, and its taillights were gone. Then I went back in through the side door. I walked back down the hallway. I turned the junction light on at the switch, then turned it off again. I don't know why. Old habit, something to do with my hands. I walked into the back office and sat down in my chair, the one I have sat in for 31 years. I did not turn on the desk lamp. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the customer's watch. I had come back for nothing complicated, just a dress watch needing a battery and a case polish, and set it on the desk in front of me. I sat in my own office, in my own building in the dark, and listened to it tick. It is a small sound. Watches always are, even in a quiet room. But in that room at that hour, it was the clearest thing I had heard all evening. Steady, precise, entirely unconcerned with what had just taken place 6 feet away on the other side of a wall. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough. I drove home. Dorothy was in bed reading. I told her I'd been held up a little. She looked at me over the top of her book, with the measured attention of a woman who has known me for 38 years and knows when not to ask. I went to my side of the bed, turned off the light. I lay in the dark, and the sentence that kept coming back was not the one about money. Not the shop. Not Meadow Pines on Route 7 or the power of attorney dressed up as something routine. It was the particular way Glenn had said, "She won't be a problem." The same measured professional tone he had used for everything else. The tone a man uses for a contract complication, for a scheduling conflict. Not for a person. Not for his own wife. I didn't know yet what that meant exactly. But 35 years of working on mechanisms that aren't behaving correctly has taught me one thing without exception: when something doesn't sit right, it is because something is wrong. I lay awake for a long time. That sentence followed me all the way to the edge of sleep, and it was still there when I woke at 3 in the morning and found I couldn't set it down. I still can't. I have always been a man who thinks better after a night of not sleeping. By 5 in the morning I had stopped trying. I made coffee before Dorothy was up and stood at the kitchen window watching the October dark give way to gray, low-settled. The kind of gray this part of the country produces in autumn, like a lid pressed down on the day. The sentence from the back office hallway was still there. It had been there all night. I knew better than to expect it to leave before I gave it somewhere to go. The morning routine ran the same as every Wednesday. I set Dorothy's pill organizer on the counter, the carbidopa levodopa sorted by day, each compartment labeled in my careful print, the way I've done it for 3 years since her diagnosis. I made Noah's lunch and put it by the door. I poured a second coffee I didn't finish. On the surface, entirely routine. Underneath, a fluorescent line under a closed door. A man's even voice, a sentence about a woman being handled like a line item in a contract. Before Noah left for school, I mentioned to Dorothy what she already knew. Victoria says she and Glenn are flying back from their conference in Portland on the 30th. She texted that they land around 3, should be home before 5. Dorothy nodded. I noted the information and moved on. At 9:15 the phone rang. Just checking in, Dad. Did you sleep okay? Victoria. Warm, easy, exactly as she always sounds. Fine, Victoria. How are you? She asked about Dorothy, about Noah. Then she mentioned the family meeting end of October, everyone together. Just to go over a few things, make sure everyone's on the same page. So, I told her that sounded fine. We talked for 4 minutes. At no point did my voice give her a single thing she could use. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. I was 33 years old when I opened the shop. In 35 years, I have never signed a contract without reading it twice. Never started a repair without first understanding what had failed and precisely why. Every mechanism I have ever worked on, from a $2 drugstore watch to a collector's tourbillon worth more than my first car, taught me the same lesson without variation. You do not touch anything until you understand what you're dealing with. I was not going to change that now. I drove to Ray Kowalski's house without calling ahead. Ray is always home on Wednesday mornings, retired firefighter, 28 years on the job. Spends most mornings on his back porch, regardless of what the weather thinks about it. I've known him since our kids were sharing a school bus route. He handed me a mug of coffee before I'd said 10 words. We sat on the porch. October rain light and unhurried coming off the roof in a thin line along the edge. I said, Ray, if someone you trusted was planning something you couldn't stop with words, what would you do? He looked at me for a long moment. Ray is not a man who fills silence with noise. Make sure I had the right tools before I did anything, he said. I nodded. He didn't ask what any of it meant. That's 30 years of knowing when a question is its own answer. I drove back through Harlow Falls and stopped at the shop. Normal mid-morning, a customer at the display, in case 2 Eddie behind the counter. The grandfather clock working through its hour in the back. I nodded to Eddie, walked through to my office and sat down. I opened the top drawer. The building deed has been in that drawer since 1990, the original title document, from when I took possession of the property. I laid it flat on the desk under the work lamp and read it through completely the way I read everything. My name. Only mine. No co-owners, no liens, no encumbrances of any kind recorded anywhere on the document. It had been this way since I signed it on a Thursday afternoon in September of 1990, and nothing had changed since. Whatever Glenn Mercer thought he was surveying when he walked through my back office making his estimates, he was looking at something that required exactly one signature to transfer. And that signature was mine alone. I folded the deed and put it in my breast pocket. I told Eddie I'd be out the rest of the day. He nodded and went back to work. Back home on Ridgecrest Drive, I went to the workshop. I built it myself in 1998, better light than the garage, lower humidity, a proper bench. The examination lamp has been on the same corner since the day the building went up. I sat at the bench without turning it on. In the bottom left drawer, I keep a small notebook, 30 years of logging repairs measurements, mechanisms that required a closer look. I opened it to the first blank page past the existing entries and ruled 3 sections with a straight edge. The first 2 I filled slowly and carefully. When I reached the 3rd section, I wrote 2 words, drew a dash after them, set the pen down, and went inside. Noah had a weather diagram spread across the kitchen table for a school assignment, labeled in his large, earnest handwriting. Dorothy asked him to explain it, and he did thoroughly, for a solid 10 minutes. I listened to every word. It was the most ordinary thing in the world, which was exactly what I needed it to be. After dinner, I went back to lock up the workshop. I stopped in the doorway. The notebook was open on the bench where I'd left it. 3rd section, 2 words, a dash, and the rest of the page empty. I looked at it for a moment in the pale light from the doorway. Then I pulled the door closed. There was more I needed to understand before I could fill in what came after that dash. What I didn't know yet was how much more there was going to be. A watchmaker learns early that the smallest things tell you the most. A worn crown gear, a bent hand, a missing screw. The mechanism tells you everything if you know how to look. I waited until Dorothy left for her Thursday physical therapy appointment before I went to the guest room. I've started every close inspection the same way for 35 years, standing in the doorway, first taking stock of what's visible before touching anything, then working inward in a fixed pattern left to right surface before concealed space. Every drawer pulled completely out, and checked underneath every piece of furniture moved far enough from the wall to see behind it properly. The whole point of methodical is that you don't skip something because you assume you already know what's there. Glenn Mercer had stayed in that room for nearly 3 weeks, August 7th through the 28th, while his kitchen renovation was underway. Caroline hadn't come with him. Glenn explained it before I could ask. She was visiting relatives in Portland for the month, a trip she'd already arranged. I didn't question it. I was glad Glenn had somewhere decent to stay while contractors worked through his kitchen, and I told him to treat the room as his own. At the time, that seemed like a generous thing to say. 20 minutes into the sweep behind the nightstand, wedged into the gap between the frame and the wall, flat against the baseboard, a manila folder. Tan letter size, no label on the tab. A faint line of dust along one edge where it had been sitting undisturbed since August. I took it to my home office and spread the contents under the work lamp. 3 financial statements filed under different LLC names. LLC stands for Limited Liability Company, a business structure that legally separates a company's debts from its owner's personal finances. It's a common and legitimate arrangement. It also makes it considerably harder to gauge someone's true financial exposure from the outside, since obligations are distributed across multiple entities rather than consolidated under one name. The 3 statements showed accounts I had never heard of with balances I didn't know existed. 2 overdue commercial loan notices, both from lenders outside Harlow Falls. 1 collections notice dated September 2025, 42 days old as of that morning. Tax identification numbers and signature lines that, if you followed them from one document to the next, led back to the same name every time. Glenn Mercer. I read every page once, then read them again. 2 failed commercial real estate developments, 1 from 2023, 1 from 2024. Both in default when the projected returns didn't materialize. The kind of failure that doesn't make news because there's nothing sudden about it. Projections overreach, a market moves the wrong direction. A balance sheet quietly deteriorates until there's nothing to recover. Total outstanding $285,000. The collections notice wasn't a preliminary warning. Proceedings were already in motion. I sat back and did the arithmetic. Glenn's estimates from 2 nights ago, shop and building $1,100,000. The house on Ridgecrest Drive, $680,000. Together $1,780,000. Against $285,000 in debt, a clean exit with over $1.5 million remaining after every obligation was settled. The math wasn't complicated. When a man is carrying that kind of debt with active collections proceedings underway, the motivation to act quickly isn't theoretical. I put the folder in my top desk drawer and called Ray. Ray, did you ever lend someone money and find out they'd been planning to take everything you had? A pause on the line. How much are we talking, Walter? Enough. You need me to come over? Not yet. I set the phone down. Stood at the window. Dorothy's lavender in the side garden was holding color in the October cold. It does this every year, right up until the first hard frost settles the question permanently. I looked at it for a moment. Then I went to the filing cabinet. I keep it locked, not for secrecy, but because I hold documents to the same standard. I hold mechanisms stored, properly retrieved, deliberately never left where they could be mishandled. I opened it and went to a section I hadn't needed for nearly 2 years. The cosign paperwork was in a red folder in the second drawer. Victoria's interior design studio. She'd opened it 8 months after Marcus died. Something to build during a year when building was the only thing that helped. When she came to me needing a loan guarantor, she was sitting at this kitchen table with her hands not quite steady. The amount was $65,000. A cosigner is someone who accepts legal responsibility for repayment if the primary borrower defaults the kind of commitment that warrants a careful read before signing. I signed it the same week we buried Marcus. I said yes before she'd finished the sentence. I'd make the same call again tomorrow, which doesn't make it any easier to look at now. Below it, in a plain white folder, a promissory note. Glenn's name, my name, $28,000, dated 3 years prior. A personal loan he'd needed short-term bridge financing for a development project he described as nearly finalized. I wrote the check the same afternoon. He mentioned it once in the months that followed, then nothing for nearly 2 years. I had almost stopped accounting for it. I laid both documents side by side on the desk under the lamp. 2 signatures. 2 entirely separate moments, different years, different conversations, different versions of what I believed I understood about my family when I had said yes without hesitating for a single second. I looked at them under the same lamp I use for the finest repair work, the mechanisms where a 0.5 millimeter error destroys the entire job. My name in my own handwriting, at the bottom of 2 documents that someone else had been quietly factoring into a plan I was never meant to know about. I sat with that for a few minutes. Then I filed everything back where it belonged, locked the cabinet, and put the key in my jacket pocket, rather than leaving it on the desk. The guest room still had a second pass to give. Methodical means thorough, and thorough means twice. I'd learned that from 35 years of working on things that looked fine until they weren't. And more than the room tomorrow, I needed someone who knew the law the way I know a movement. Not a general opinion, a professional. One specific person. I had her card in a drawer I hadn't opened in 4 years, and I knew exactly which one without having to think about it. When I built the shop, I learned that the most important thing about calling in an expert isn't what you ask them to do. It's knowing the right moment to call. By Thursday evening, I had the documents. By Friday morning, I had the questions. Shortly after 8, I called Sandra Howell's office and made a 9 o'clock appointment. I told her only that I needed an hour and that it involved an estate matter and a possible property transaction. She said she had the time. Sandra Howell has practiced family and estate law in Harlow Falls for 22 years. Her office is on the third floor of a building on Kessler Avenue, the elevator a short hallway, a door with her name in plain black letters that hasn't needed updating once. The office itself is the kind of room that doesn't try to impress you. Law books, a clean desk, a window with October trees gone fully gold outside. She's a professional who has heard every version of this kind of story and has enough time for all of them. I appreciated that before I'd said a word. I laid the documents on her desk in sequence: Glenn's financial statements, the building deed, the co-sign paperwork, the promissory note. Then I told her everything I'd overheard in the back hallway on Tuesday night, factually in order without editorializing or adding anything I hadn't directly heard. The way I'd describe a damaged movement to another technician here is, the mechanism here is, what I observed here are the components. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she asked 3 clarifying questions: the building deed, the house title, and whether any power of attorney had previously been executed in my name. The shop building titled in your name only since 1990. And the house transferred to my name alone 3 years ago when we updated our estate documents. Dorothy's name came off at her request. She wanted the structure simplified. Sandra folded her hands on the desk. Then no power of attorney is valid without your own signature, Walter. A POAA document that grants another person legal authority to make financial and property decisions on your behalf requires the fully voluntary, competent consent of the person granting it. You are clearly competent, and without a POA already in place, the only remaining avenue would be a court-ordered guardianship petition. That requires a judge formal medical evaluation and a full hearing. No guardianship petition succeeds in this jurisdiction without a significant legal battle. She paused. One they would lose. She leaned back slightly in her chair. The building, the business, the house, they have nothing without your signature, and nothing about what you've described gives them any legal mechanism to compel it. I let that sit for a moment. How quickly could a cash sale on the shop be completed? I know a group that has been asking about that property for 2 years, she said. Meridian Watch Group. I handled their previous inquiries when you weren't in a position to sell. Cash buyers, well-capitalized, motivated, and prepared to move quickly. 8 to 10 working days if the title is clean and both parties are ready to commit. The title has been clean since 1990, I said. I've never signed anything I haven't read twice. I'll call them today. She made a note. I'll also put you in contact with Phil Connolly, a commercial broker I use for transactions of this type. He'll handle the listing side and represent your interests in the negotiations. Before I stood up, Sandra asked if there was anything else I needed to cover. I paused. I was thinking about the particular way Glenn had said, "She won't be a problem." The flat professional tone of it. The thing that had kept me awake 2 nights running. But I had only a feeling I couldn't lay on a desk between us, couldn't describe as anything more than 2 words and a dash in a notebook. Not yet, I said. I'll let you know. On the way home, I pulled into the lot at Briggs & Co. and went inside. Mid-afternoon, an ordinary Friday, a customer at the display in case 2, holding a vintage Longines up toward the window light, the way people do when they're deciding whether something is worth what it costs. Eddie behind the counter with a movement open in front of him. I stood at my own counter for 10 minutes without saying much. I watched the shop run the way it has always run. Then I left. I didn't need anything from it that afternoon. I think I just needed to see it. Victoria stopped by that evening. She poured her own coffee without asking, the way she's done it at this table since she was 17, and sat down like she belonged there because she once had. She touched Dorothy's hand while she talked. She laughed at something Noah said, a real laugh, the one that starts in her eyes before it reaches anywhere else. I sat across from her, and watched her perform the daughter she either used to be or still believed herself to be. I performed the father with equal care and equal precision. We were both very good at it. The coffee went cold while we covered everything that wasn't the point. After Noah was in bed and Victoria's car had cleared the driveway, I went to the workshop. Dorothy came to the door about 20 minutes later. She stood in the frame the way she does when she's decided to say something she's been holding for a while. "She's been coming around a lot," Dorothy said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, you have that look, Walter." "What look?" "The one you have when you've already made a decision but you're still checking the tolerances." She went back inside. She didn't wait for a response, which told me she hadn't asked a question. That's what 38 years of marriage teaches you when the sentence is already finished, before it's spoken. I stayed in the workshop after she was gone. The notebook was open on the bench, third section, Caroline, with the dash I'd drawn 2 nights ago. Below it, still a blank half page. I picked up the pen, set it down. I've been doing this work long enough to know the difference between a feeling and a finding. A feeling is a hypothesis. It's the moment before you open the case. A finding is what's actually there when you do. The feeling had been in place since Tuesday night. The finding would have to come on its own. What I knew, sitting in that workshop with the lamp on and the notebook open, was that I needed to look more carefully before I could trust what I thought I was looking at. I closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, went back inside. The weekend passed, the way weekends do when you are carrying something you haven't named yet, slowly on the outside and not at all on the inside. Saturday morning, I took Noah to the park and pushed him on the swings for 20 minutes. Saturday afternoon, I painted the loose section of the back fence that had been bothering me since September. Sunday, I refilled Dorothy's pill organizer, went through the week's mail-cooked dinner, and said nothing to anyone that wasn't perfectly ordinary. The surface held without any visible effort, which told me more than anything else that I had been doing this kind of work, the work of maintaining a surface while something moves underneath it, for a very long time. Monday morning, Dorothy to her physical therapy appointment at 8. Noah to school at 8:15. I stood in the front doorway and watched the car turn the corner. Then I went to the guest room. A methodical second pass looks different from the first. The first pass covers what's present and visible, what draws the eye, what's displaced or out of place. The second pass covers the negative space, what's behind the obvious surfaces, what's in the gaps between things, what a person might push out of sight in the 5 seconds before someone unexpected walks through a door. I've done second pass inspections on movements that looked clean from the outside and found hairline fractures in the very last place I looked. You look there anyway, behind the headboard, not the wall, but the gap between the headboard frame and the wall itself, a 2-inch clearance that you'd only reach if you moved the piece forward and angled a bundle of papers. Folded once. Slightly rumpled. The way things get when they've been picked up and put down more than once. 16 pages printed on office weight paper. I carried them to my home office and sat down under the work lamp. Pages 1 through 8 were the plan in their own language. Not overheard through a wall, written down, dated, explicit. The kind of documentation a person produces when they believe no one outside the room will ever see it. The exact language they'd settled on for the power of attorney request, just for safety, with Mom's current situation, careful, sympathetic. The phrasing of people who knew how to frame a legal transfer as an act of love. Glenn's sale timeline mapped in 4-week intervals running from November through February. Meadow Pines Senior Center named directly with a monthly rate, and a room type circled a 2-bed on the residential wing, $4,800 a month. The proceeds split specified in percentage terms after Glenn's outstanding debts were cleared. My life, the shop, the house. 35 years of work, reduced to a liquidation schedule with a completion date of February 2026. I read all 8 pages without putting them down once. Then I turned to page 9. Pages 9 through 16 were a different document entirely, not a business plan. Something else, the kind of correspondence that happens between two people who have decided what they want and are no longer being careful about how they describe it. I read them the way I read everything line by line, without skipping, without letting my eye move ahead, before the current sentence was fully absorbed. At page 12, I stopped. I set the papers face down on the desk, stood up, went to the back door, and stepped out into the October yard. The light at that hour was flat and gray, the particular gray of a Pacific Northwest morning that has decided it isn't going to offer anything warmer. I stood in it. The lavender along the side of the fence had gone gray too, the way it does in late October, when the color has given up without the plant quite following. I stood out there long enough for the cold to settle into my jacket. Then I went back inside, sat down, picked up the papers again, turned to page 13, read through to page 16, page 14. Glenn to Victoria. Caroline's been asking to call her parents again. Victoria, don't let her. We're too close now. Glenn understood. I read those 3 lines. Read them again. Set the papers down flat on the desk and looked at the wall above the lamp for a moment. 3 sentences. 41 words. Victoria was not simply helping Glenn manage a financial plan. She was actively preventing her sister from making a phone call home. I folded all 16 pages back the way I'd found them, one fold, same crease, and put them in the top desk drawer with everything else. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, stood at the window without drinking it. Dorothy's lavender in the side garden. The fence I'd painted on Saturday. The ordinary October yard of a life I had built carefully and in good faith, and which someone had been measuring for liquidation. I opened the notebook, 3rd section, Caroline with the dash. Below it I wrote 1 new line, closed it. Dorothy came home from her appointment at 11:15. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't know specifically what was wrong. But Dorothy has been reading my face for 38 years, and she didn't need the details to read the room. She put the kettle on the stove without saying anything, which is its own kind of question. She set 2 cups on the table and sat across from me. How bad is it, Walter? I didn't answer the question she'd asked. I said, I need to make a call tomorrow. She nodded once. We sat with the tea. Neither of us said anything more until I got up to start dinner. The tea wasn't really about the tea, we both knew that. It was about sitting across from each other long enough for me to remember that I wasn't doing this alone, which is the thing she was telling me by staying at the table. There is a particular kind of silence between 2 people who have been married a long time. It carries more information than most conversations. This was the silence between Dorothy and me Tuesday morning at the kitchen table before either of us had said a word about the night before. She poured coffee. I set 2 cups down. The morning routine around us, pill organizer on the counter, Noah's backpack by the door. The particular quality of Pacific Northwest October light coming through the window over the sink ran on its own. I opened the notebook to the 3rd section and showed her page 14. She read it without speaking. Then I told her the rest of it, the conversation I'd overheard in the back hallway of the shop, the folder behind Glenn's nightstand, the 16 printed pages with their liquidation schedules and their projected closing dates, the co-signed paperwork with my signatures, the promissory note, Sandra Howell, and the confirmation that no power of attorney could proceed without my consent, Phil Connolly, and the preliminary interest from Meridian Watch Group. I laid it out in sequence, the same way I'd laid Glenn's documents on Sandra's desk, factually in order, without adding anything I hadn't directly observed or confirmed. Dorothy listened the way she always listens, completely, without interrupting, without letting anything show in her face, until she had the whole of it. When I finished, she looked down at page 14 again. She straightened it with both hands on the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she did it, the Parkinson's making itself known the way it always does in the morning, A reminder I never remark on because it doesn't need my commentary. She looked at it for a long moment. Do what you need to do, she said. I'll be right here. She put her hand over mine on the table and didn't move it for a while. That was all there was to say, and we both knew it. The morning passed. I made calls I needed to make. I went through mail I'd been letting accumulate. I ate lunch at the workshop bench and looked at my father's pocket watch under the lamp without opening it. By 2:30, Noah's school bus had turned the corner at the end of Ridgecrest, and the back door opened, and his backpack hit the floor the way it always does, decisively, without apology. He climbed up to the chair across from me at the kitchen table. I was working on a broken clasp, a straightforward repair, the kind I do with one hand now. Something to keep my fingers moving, while my head does other things. Noah pulled out his colored pencils and spread them across his half of the table. A drawing for a class assignment, a house with a fence, the kind of orderly scene that 8-year-olds draw when they're showing what they know about the world. We sat together without speaking. That's how we've always operated, the boy and I, comfortable in the same space without needing to fill it. He drew. I worked the clasp. The kitchen clock ran. The afternoon light shifted. I was holding the repaired clasp up to check the hinge when, without quite deciding to, I reached for my coffee, and my eyes moved to the refrigerator. A family photo from last Christmas was held there with 2 magnets, Walter, Dorothy, Victoria, Noah, all at the table, and Carolyn in the background behind them, quieter than everyone else, a half step away from the center of things. Noah followed my gaze. "Grandpa, is Aunt Caroline sick?" I set the clasp down carefully on the bench mat. "Why do you ask, buddy?" Noah kept his eyes on his drawing, toning the sky section blue with steady, deliberate strokes. "Because when me and Mom went to visit her, I think it was before Christmas, Aunt Caroline had a really big purple mark on her arm. Right here." He touched his own wrist without looking up. "Uncle Glenn said she bumped into the garage door, but it looked like the ones I get when Dylan pushes me at recess. Except way bigger." A short pause. He added a fence post at the left edge of his drawing. "And Mom told me not to talk about it." I kept my voice level. "Did she say anything else about it, buddy?" Noah set the blue pencil down. Picked up green. Considered the question the way children do when they're trying to recall precise words rather than general meaning. "She said Uncle Glenn just has a different way of doing things, and that Aunt Caroline knows that." He paused, getting it right. "And she said if I talked about it, it would make things complicated for the family." He went back to the fence, added a second post, then looked up at me for the first time since he'd started drawing. "Is she okay, Grandpa?" I looked at this boy, 8 years old, a house and a sun and a careful blue sky in front of him, telling me something devastating in the same relaxed voice he'd used to describe what he'd had for lunch. A child who hadn't yet learned to put distance between what he knew and what he said. "I'm going to make sure she is," I told him. He nodded. He seemed satisfied with that. He picked up the green pencil again and added a third fence post, and that was the end of it, for him, a question asked. Answered, done. I drove to Ray's house after dinner, while Dorothy was settling Noah for the night. I knocked on the back door, and Ray handed me a coffee, and we sat on the porch, and I told him everything. Not the outline I'd given him the week before. Not a question asked carefully to test the water, everything. The conversation in the shop hallway, the folder, the 16 printed pages, page 14. And then last Noah's exact words in the exact tone he'd used while he toned that sky blue and thought he was just answering a simple question about his aunt. Ray listened to all of it without saying a word. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do you need from me?" "Not yet," I said. "But I needed you to know." "You have it." He refilled my cup. All of it. I also told him Phil Connolly had confirmed Meridian Watch Group's preliminary interest in the property. The price worked. They were motivated buyers with cash ready to commit. All that remained was my formal written authorization to proceed, which meant one more visit to Sandra Howell's office. I told Ray I was signing it tomorrow morning. He nodded. Didn't make anything of it. That's what I've always valued about Ray. He understands when something is a statement and when it's a decision. And he knows the difference between those two things requires a different kind of response. I drove home. The workshop light was still on. I went in, sat at the bench, opened the notebook to the third section. Below the entries already there, I added 3 more lines. Then I closed it and put the pen down. The section was longer than it had been that morning. I knew what it was building toward, but there was still one more thing I needed, something I could hold in my hands and look at directly before I could move on. What I suspected. I would go looking for it tomorrow. I had a feeling I already knew where to find it. The hardest part of any careful plan is not making the decision. It's maintaining the surface while the work happens underneath, one step at a time, no shortcuts, no tell. I was at Sandra's office by 9 Wednesday morning, with the documents organized the same way I always bring things to a professional, in the order they'd need to be addressed, every page present. Nothing missing. Phil Connolly was already there, the commercial broker Sandra works with on property transactions, a man in his late 40s who moves through paperwork the way experienced people do without ceremony. He had Meridian Watch Group's formal offer ready on the table. $1,380,000 cash. 8 to 10 working day close. The name Briggs & Company. Timepieces retained in full. All current staff kept on under the terms of the buyer's agreement, a condition I had been clear about from the start, and that Phil had put in writing. I read every page. Phil made a remark about it, something light, the kind of thing people say when they want to move things along. I said, "I've never signed anything I haven't read twice. I'm not starting now." I turned to the last page, read it, and signed the formal authorization. The transaction was in motion. Sandra then submitted the written revocation notice to Harlow Falls Credit Union. A co-signer on a business loan has the legal right under most guarantee agreements to revoke their obligation by giving the lender advance written notice. The original contract with Victoria's studio included a 60-day revocation clause, which Sandra had confirmed the week before. The bank would notify Victoria that her guarantor had withdrawn and that the 60-day clock was running. Whatever she did with that information was her business. Separately, Sandra began formal demand proceedings on Glenn's promissory note, a legally issued demand for repayment on an outstanding personal loan. He would receive certified notice by Monday morning. Neither action required Glenn's participation. Neither required mine beyond having already signed 30 years ago. On the way home, I stopped at the shop. I parked in my usual space and went in through the front the way a customer would. Normal Wednesday afternoon, Eddie working. A woman at the display cases near the window. I walked through the showroom, through the hallway into the back office. Sat down in my chair for 60 seconds. Looked at the desk, the lamp, the wall where I've hung the same repair calendar since 2003. Then I stood up and left without turning off the light. I didn't leave the light on for any particular reason. Some things just don't need a reason. That evening at 7 o'clock, I dialed Caroline's number. 3 rings, then Glenn's voice. "Walter." "Hey." The warmth of someone who has rehearsed the warmth until it comes automatically, without effort the way breathing does. "I was hoping to speak with Caroline," I said. "She's resting, not feeling well today. Some kind of headache she's been fighting." "Is she there?" "I'll only be a minute." A brief pause, the kind that's calibrated. "She's asleep, Walter. I'd hate to wake her." The call ended a few seconds later. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. Then I went into my call history and worked backward from the present. Last incoming call from Caroline's number, April 21st. Before that, February 8th. Before that, November of last year. 3 calls in 11 months, each one spaced further apart than the last. When I looked at the texts from her number, they ran more regularly, but they came in the evenings, and they came in clusters, always between 7 and 9 o'clock, exactly the window when Glenn would be home. I read them all the way back to March. They sounded like Carolyn. The words sounded right, the phrasing familiar, the small references she'd always made. But the timing was Glenn's pattern, not hers. I wrote 2 things in the notebook. Then I went to the garage to bring in a storage box from the back of the truck. I pulled the light chain. The single bulb in the center of the garage ceiling came on the way it always does, slightly delayed the way old fluorescent fixtures do before they decide to commit. Along the back wall above the workbench is the secondary mail shelf. I keep it distinct from the main household mail. This shelf catches the overflow. The catalogs, the promotional flyers, the circulars and community newsletters that don't require action, only eventual disposal. I process it in batches every few months or whenever it starts to bother me. The last time I'd gone through it properly was July. I moved the box aside and reached up to shift the pile so I could set the box down on the shelf beside it. 2 thick home improvement catalogs slid off the top of the stack and fell to the garage floor. Between them, held in place by the same catalogs that had been burying it since sometime before July, a small white envelope. No street address in the return field. Only C. Mercer. And in the upper left corner, written in the careful, slightly smaller script she'd always used for emphasis, Dad only. I did not move. I looked at the postmark. June 14th, 2025. 4 months ago, in the middle of a summer, I had spent thinking Caroline was fine, that Glenn managed things, that her silence was ordinary distance, and nothing more. 4 months this envelope had been sitting between 2 catalogs on a shelf in my own garage, while I unlocked that door, reached past it, moved past it without seeing it probably a dozen times. I set the box down on the concrete floor. I stood in the garage under the fluorescent light for a moment. Then I went inside, hung my keys on the hook, said goodnight to Dorothy, and went to my side of the bed. I lay in the dark. Tomorrow morning, after Dorothy left for physical therapy and Noah was at school, I would go back to the garage. I would bring that envelope to the workshop, to the examination lamp, to the surface where I do work that cannot afford to miss a single thing. I had been carrying a feeling about my younger daughter since a Tuesday night in October, when I heard 5 words through a wall. Tomorrow I would find out whether it was still just a feeling. Before I open that envelope, I need to know you're still here with me. If you've made it this far, drop the number 68 in the comments right now. That's Walter's age, and just 2 digits, it tells me everything I need to know. Because what's inside that envelope is going to change the shape of this entire story, and I don't want you to miss it. A note before we continue: some elements in this story are fictional, built for reflection and education. If that's not content you're comfortable with, it's completely okay to step away, no hard feelings at all. A watchmaker understands a few things about small details. A hairspring displaced by 1/1000th of a millimeter will stop a watch completely. A letter sitting in a pile of secondary mail for 4 months can do the same thing to a family. Dorothy left for her physical therapy appointment at 8. Noah's bus came at 8:15. I stood at the front door and watched the bus make the corner at the far end of Ridgecrest, the same way I had 2 days before, and waited until it was gone before I turned and went through the house to the garage. I didn't rush. Rushing is what you do when you're afraid of what's coming. I've handled enough delicate mechanisms to know that the moment you introduce speed into work that doesn't permit it, you start making errors that compound themselves quietly until something breaks beyond repair. I walked to the garage. I pulled the light chain. The fluorescent bulb came on with its usual brief delay. The secondary mail pile was where I'd left it, shifted slightly from the night before. The 2 catalogs I'd knocked to the floor now stacked flat on the bench beside the pile. I reached up to the shelf and found the envelope without having to search for it. My hand went directly to it. The way your hand goes to a thing you've been thinking about since you last set it down. I held it under the garage light with both hands. An experienced eye reads an object before it reads the text inside it. The envelope was a standard letter-size off-white, the kind you find in a value pack at a drugstore. Unsealed edges, she had pressed them firmly, but the flap had lifted slightly at one corner over 4 months, the way envelopes do in mild humidity. The ink was blue ballpoint, the particular shade she's always preferred, the blue, that's slightly darker than standard, closer to navy. And the handwriting. I have known Carolyn's handwriting since she was 7 years old and learning cursive at this kitchen table, working through worksheets with the focused seriousness of a child who wanted to get things exactly right. She has always written the W in my name the same way, 2 deliberate loops that take longer than any other letter in the line, like she's making sure it counts. Those loops were on this envelope. That was her W. The postmark read June 14th, 2025. I stood in the garage and did the count. 4 months. 4 months and 9 days from the date it was postmarked to the night I found it between 2 catalogs. It had sat on that shelf while I had passed that shelf unlocked. That door reached for tools on the bench beneath it, stood in this garage dozens of times on ordinary errands. 4 months and 9 days, during which I had no particular reason to sort the secondary mail. During which I had assumed, without examining, the assumption that Caroline was fine. In the upper left corner, in ink slightly lighter than the rest of the envelope, written more carefully, each letter separated and deliberate, Dad only. I don't know how long I stood there reading those 2 words under that garage light. Long enough for them to stop being words and become something else, await a direction. A set of instructions a person only writes when they have learned, through specific experience, that the alternative is something worse. I carried the envelope to the workshop. 10 months ago, I last sat directly across from Caroline at any length. Christmas Eve, 2024. Dorothy's good china, the centerpiece she assembles every year from things she collects at the fall market. Noah in his best sweater refusing to sit still. And Caroline. She had been quiet through most of the meal, not in her usual contained way, but in a way that I had categorized at the time as tired. She works hard. She'd had a long year. She sat with her wine and was mostly elsewhere. Glenn had talked at length about a development project he was working on in the Willamette Valley lease terms, projected timelines, the kind of confident forward projection that sounds entirely plausible when you have no knowledge of the documents that contradict it. I had listened and passed dishes and thought Caroline has someone who manages things. I had felt relieved by that. I want to be honest about what I was feeling at that table, relieved. Glad she didn't have to navigate things alone. I had been wrong about what she was navigating. And then Noah's voice. Tuesday afternoon, while blue pencil moved across sky. It looked like the ones I get when Dylan pushes me at recess, except way bigger. A child's comparative scale, the only reference frame he had. I set the envelope on the workshop bench, centered under the examination lamp, with the flap facing up and the Dad only visible in the lamp's direct light. I've kept that lamp on the same corner of that bench for 24 years. It's the lamp I use when I cannot afford to miss a single thing: cracked pivot holes, worn pallets, the invisible fractures that only announce themselves when the mechanism fails at the worst possible moment. I pulled the stool out from under the bench and sat down. I didn't open it right away. I looked at it for a moment. The way you look at a mechanism before you begin taking in what's there, preparing the workspace inside yourself, understanding that what comes next cannot be undone. The envelope, the handwriting, the postmark, Dad only. All the information that existed on the outside of this thing before I had read a single word of the inside. On the bench to my right, in the small tray, where I keep hand tools during active work, the brass letter opener Dorothy gave me for our 20th anniversary. She'd found it at an estate auction, Victorian origin, turned handle, kept sharp for 20 years, without ever needing attention. I use it on everything. I picked it up, ran my thumb along the flat edge and set it back down in the tray. Some things you don't want to cut open. Some things you want to open in the way the person who sealed them would have intended, which is by hand, carefully, so that nothing tears that doesn't need to. I worked the flap the rest of the way open with my thumb slowly working the edge where it had already partly lifted, pressing flat as I went. It took about 45 seconds. When I was finished, the envelope was open and intact. I drew the letter out. 2 handwritten pages, the same blue ink, her characteristic pressure on the downstrokes, the careful spacing of someone who thinks about what they're putting on a page before they commit it. I unfolded them along the existing creases, which were slightly compressed from 4 months of pressure, and laid them flat under the lamp. The letter began, Dad. Not Dear Dad, not any formal salutation, just the one word followed by a period. She has always written to me this way, when she needs to go directly to the point without preamble, since she was 12 years old, and leaving notes on my workbench about things she needed to talk about. The ones that began with my name and nothing else, because the name was already enough of a beginning. I read the next 2 sentences. If you're reading this, it means I finally managed to get it sent. It took me 3 attempts before I could get it to the mailbox without him seeing. I placed the letter face down on the bench. Both pages face down the way you set something down, only when you need a second before you can keep going. I breathed, counted to 5, looked at the lamp. Then I picked it back up and kept reading. Under an examination lamp, there is nowhere for a flaw to hide. That is precisely why I use it. The letter ran 2 full pages. I read the first page without stopping. Glenn had taken Caroline's personal phone in March for safekeeping, was the phrase she put in quotation marks, which told me exactly how he'd said it. Since then, the only unsupervised telephone access she had was the landline at Harlow Cedar Pharmacy on Cedar Street on Tuesdays and Fridays, when Glenn drove her for minor errands and sat waiting in the car, 15 minutes maximum. She had to be back at the car before he came in looking. She could not call from the house because Glenn reviewed the landline's call log every Sunday morning. She had written down my number from memory and kept it inside the spine of a book on the kitchen shelf, a paperback she had owned since college, one Glenn had never shown interest in, which was why it was safe. She could not leave the house without Glenn present. He reviewed her outgoing emails before they were sent. She had learned this the way people learn surveillance, by testing it once and watching what happened immediately after. She had stopped emailing anything that mattered. She did not have access to her own bank account. Her name had been removed from the joint account without her understanding precisely when it had happened, only that it had. 8 months ago, she had pushed back. She hadn't told me what form that took. She didn't need to. She described what happened afterward with the careful, compressed language of someone who has learned to convey the shape of a thing without having to say every word of it directly, and the shape was unmistakable. I read those lines and understood them. I did not need clarification. He said if I tried to leave, no one would believe me, that I was too sensitive, that I misunderstood how a family operates. I put those 3 sentences down on the bench beside the lamp and looked at them for a moment. Then I picked the letter back up, folded separately inside the second page, 3 photographs. Printed at an instant photo kiosk, she'd specified it in the letter a disposable camera. Paid for in cash at a pharmacy she'd visited once while Glenn waited outside in the car. I laid all 3 flat on the bench surface under the lamp. I am not going to describe them in detail here. I looked at each one for a long time. The examination lamp is designed to make everything visible, and it did what it was designed to do, and I sat with what it showed me. The remaining photographs were documentation she'd managed to photograph 4 pages from Glenn's home desk during a business trip of his, the only period in recent months when she'd been in the house alone for any length of time. A separate LLC structure, not present in the financial statements I'd found in the guest room, a different entity holding account assets positioned to be invisible in any future divorce proceeding. I recognized elements of the entity structure from the folder behind Glenn's nightstand, but Caroline's photographs showed the full architecture. Every layer accounted for. Every exit for her sealed. Then the final section. I slowed down here. I read every word individually, the way you read something you need to fully absorb before you can respond to it. I know Victoria knows Dad. She came by in September. I didn't have time to cover my arm. I thought she would say something. Instead, she took Noah to the park for 2 hours, and when she came back, she told me I shouldn't make things harder than they already are. That Glenn is under a lot of pressure right now. She left after dinner. She hasn't called since. She knew, and she said nothing. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because you should know exactly what you're dealing with. I did not skim that paragraph. I read it through twice. The letter ended. I don't know if you'll ever find this. I almost didn't send it. But you once told me if a mechanism is broken, and you know it's broken, and you do nothing, that isn't patience. That's negligence. I love you, Dad. I sat still for a long time. The lamp ran. The workshop was entirely quiet. I folded the letter and the photographs back into the envelope carefully, along the original creases, and put them in the top desk drawer with everything else. Then I went into the house. Dorothy was in the kitchen. She had returned from her appointment while I was reading, which I had not heard. She looked at my face when I came through the door and immediately stopped what she was doing. I handed her the envelope. She sat down at the kitchen table and read slowly all the way through without looking up from the page. I stood at the counter and did not watch her read. I watched the window. When I heard her set the pages down, I turned. Her hands were trembling slightly as she smoothed the letter flat, the Parkinsons, and perhaps something else as well. She didn't cry. Dorothy does not cry in the moment when something requires action. She straightens it and deals with it. She pressed both palms flat on the pages for a moment. Then she looked up at me. Get her out first, Dorothy said. Everything else comes after. That's the plan. She looked at me steadily. All of it, all of it. She nodded once. A single, complete nod. Good. She got up and put the kettle on. I took the envelope back to the workshop. I opened the notebook to the third section. I filled in the last remaining blank on the final line. The section was complete. I looked at it, at what it had become over the course of 10 days, from 2 words and a dash to something that covered most of the page in my careful print. Everything was there. The sequence. The order. What had to happen first and why. I had a phone call to make tonight to a person Caroline had never met, who handles situations exactly like this one professionally and would know precisely what to do with a letter. 3 photographs and a pharmacy on Cedar Street with a landline and a 15-minute window. I carried my phone into the workshop and closed the door so Dorothy wouldn't hear. In watchmaking, you sometimes have to service 2 movements at once, one on the bench, one in hand. It requires discipline, but it can be done. By Thursday night, I had made the call. By Friday morning, I had 2 appointments. Sandra's office at 9. She confirmed both notices had gone out on the schedule she'd committed to the guarantee revocation to Harlow Falls Credit Union. The formal demand for repayment to Glenn Mercer by certified mail. Glenn would have the demand letter in his hands Monday morning. The credit union would notify Victoria that her co-signer had withdrawn within the week, and her 60-day clock would begin from the date of that notification. Sandra also had the trust documents prepared, the irrevocable trust structure for the house that would place the property outside the reach of any future legal maneuver, with a successor trustee named and everything in order. She'd had them ready for 3 days. I told her I wanted to execute those documents on the same calendar day as the shop closing, not before. She nodded, made a note, and said she'd hold them until I told her we were ready. She didn't ask why I'd chosen that sequence. A good attorney hears when a client has thought something through. The Ironwood Cafe is on the east side of Harlow Falls, a small place I'd been to perhaps twice in 15 years, which was exactly why I chose it. The kind of establishment where nobody who knows you expects to see you. Patricia Sims was already in the corner booth when I arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She's been coordinating domestic crisis response for a regional family services network for 11 years, 340 cases handled, she'd mentioned on the phone. Not as a credential, but as a matter of fact, as someone might mention the number of miles they've driven on a route they know very well. She had a notepad and a cup of coffee, and no expression that was designed to make me comfortable, which I respected immediately. I laid out what I had in the order it had arrived: the letter, the photographs, Glenn's financial documents, and Caroline's note about the pharmacy on Cedar Street. Patricia read everything without speaking. When she finished, she went back to 2 specific pages and read them a second time, asking a single clarifying question about the LLC documentation. She didn't perform sympathy. She processed information. Then in this type of situation, the person in the home has to be the one who initiates contact, she said. Not a family member on her behalf. Her. She already has, I said. The letter was her initiation. She wrote it in June, found a way to mail it without being observed, and included the pharmacy information herself. She did all of that before I knew any of this was happening. Patricia looked at me for a moment. Then we proceed from there. She set her pen down and described exactly what would happen next. She would contact Harlow Cedar Pharmacy on Cedar Street Tuesday morning and speak with the manager, explaining that a welfare call needed to come through their landline for a regular customer. The pharmacy would cooperate. They have a protocol for this, used it before. When Caroline came in on Tuesday or Friday and the call was arranged, Patricia would speak with her directly and confirm her willingness to proceed. If Caroline confirmed, and only if Caroline confirmed, they would coordinate departure for a window when Glenn's absence could be verified for a minimum of 3 hours. She said it the way you'd describe a procedure you've performed correctly many times. No hesitation. No unnecessary words. I drove home feeling for the first time since I'd found the envelope that something with a moving part was actually moving. Sunday afternoon, I called Ray from the workshop. He listened while I described what I needed: a meeting invitation for Glenn on Thursday morning. Something that looked credible. Something in the commercial real estate space, the world Glenn operated in and would not immediately question. A professional contact, a specific location, a reason to leave the house and stay gone for at least 3 hours. Ray has investment partners from his years in the fire department pension fund, men who've put money into commercial property and know the language. He said he could arrange a plausible introduction through one of them, something with enough apparent upside that Glenn wouldn't think twice before showing up. This could go wrong, Walter, Ray said. He wasn't trying to talk me out of anything. He was making sure I'd done the accounting. I know, I said. I've accounted for it. Sandra Howell has a sealed envelope with my name on it in her office. If anything goes sideways before Thursday, she opens it. It has the letter copies of every document, a summary of what I know and how I know it, and Patricia's contact information. Ray is listed as the person to call. A pause. All right, Ray said. I'll handle the meeting. Through the rest of the weekend, I kept everything in order on the surface. Saturday morning coffee, Dorothy's medications, sorted Noah's breakfast. A text from Victoria at 9:15. Hi, Dad. How's Mom? Is Noah behaving? I replied, everyone's fine. Taking Noah to the park this afternoon. Talk soon. I took him to the park. I pushed him on the swings for 20 minutes while thinking about the operating hours of a pharmacy on Cedar Street and whether Patricia would be able to reach the manager before Tuesday's window, and what would happen if Caroline's schedule had changed since June and she no longer came in on the days she'd written about. Noah asked me to push him higher. I pushed him higher. That's all a grandfather can do sometimes. By Sunday night, I had not heard back from Patricia, which she had said to expect she would not contact me until she had something definite to report. I did not call her. Waiting is a skill. You practice it until it feels like work, and then you practice it until it stops feeling like anything. Monday afternoon, 4:17, Patricia called. I reached her this morning through the pharmacy. The call ran 4 minutes. A brief pause. She said yes. She said she's been waiting for someone to ask. I stood in the kitchen and held on to those 2 sentences. Not because I needed time to process the information, I understood it immediately, but because some things need a moment before you move past them. I thanked Patricia. We confirmed Tuesday and Thursday as the working days for now, and that she would call me the moment the Thursday window was viable. I hung up. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the wall calendar, the one Dorothy has kept, in the same spot above the counter since 2009, with birthdays and appointments written in her careful hand. Victoria had mentioned it 3 weeks ago in the kitchen, over a cup of coffee that was about something else entirely. They'd land around 3, should be home before 5. Thursday, which meant Glenn was in the air or in transit from approximately noon onward, which meant the viable window was the morning from whenever Patricia could get Caroline out until Glenn's flight left Portland. I ran the available hours in my head. Morning departure at 8:09 at the outside, call it a 5 to 6 hour window before any risk of Glenn returning early. That was enough. More than the minimum, less than comfortable. But enough. I went back to the workshop. I have never been a man who hesitates. I make decisions the way I perform repairs methodically, completely, never second-guessing the work once it's done. Tuesday night was the only exception. The house was quiet. Dorothy and Noah had both been asleep for an hour. I went to the workshop, turned on the work lamp, and sat down with what I needed: 2 sheets of plain white paper, side by side on the bench, and the good pen I keep in the top right drawer for documents and correspondence. Not the everyday pen. The one I sign things with. I wrote Glenn's letter first. It came quickly. The way a diagnosis comes quickly, once you've identified every component of the malfunction, you name the parts in order, and you state what each one means. The completed sale of Briggs & Company timepieces to Meridian Watch Group. The purchase price, the buyer, the effective date of closing. The irrevocable trust for the property at Ridgecrest Drive, to be executed at closing, a trust structure that places the asset beyond the reach of any future petition claim or legal maneuver. The written revocation of my guarantee on Victoria's business loan, submitted to Harlow Falls Credit Union, with the 60-day notice period now running. The formal demand for repayment of the $28,000 promissory note, currently held by Sandra Howell's office with certified delivery confirmed. Every financial assumption he had been building since a Tuesday evening in October when he stood in my back office with a phone on speakerphone and described my life in numbers, every assumption closed. Every door locked from the inside by the person who owned the building. I named each one in the letter by name. Then I signed it, folded it in thirds, set it to the left of the lamp. I picked up the second sheet of paper. I wrote Victoria at the top. 3 sentences. Then I stopped. I set the pen down. Went to the kitchen. Poured a glass of water and stood at the window without drinking it, looking at the dark yard, Dorothy's lavender, a gray shape in the October night. Victoria, at 9 years old. The high wooden stool she used to drag from behind the counter at the shop so she could sit at my level while I worked. She'd spent 2 full hours there once a Saturday. I was working on a regulator movement that required complete silence and steady hands, and she hadn't said a single word for the entire time, which was remarkable for a 9-year-old and has never been repeated since. She just watched. The same patience that came easily to her then, and which she put down somewhere between 9 and 38 and never picked back up. When it was over, she'd looked at the clock on the wall and asked, "Dad, why doesn't the clock hand ever go backward?" I'd said, "Because it's built to go forward." She'd accepted that with the seriousness of a child who was actually considering it. Then she slid off the stool and went to find her mother, walking her down the aisle 25 years after that question. The particular quiet of a church before a ceremony begins the hush of something about to be formally started. Victoria in white, her hand light on my arm, her face doing the complicated emotional arithmetic of a person on a threshold. Then Marcus at the end of it extending his hand toward mine. A firm handshake, warm, direct, the handshake of a man who wants you to know you can trust him. I had trusted him. I had trusted all of them. I had been in many ways a man who trusted the people in his life the way he trusted a mechanism he'd built himself, with the assumption that it would hold because he had put it together carefully. She knew, and she said nothing. I set the glass of water on the counter and went back to the workshop. I picked up the pen. I did not write about what I felt. A letter written from the raw center of a thing like this is a document of emotion, and emotion is not what Victoria needed from me. What she needed was a clear accounting of what I knew and how thoroughly I knew it, so that she would understand when she read it that there was no version of Thursday in which the plan she had been building since before I found that folder behind Glenn's nightstand had any remaining possibility of proceeding. I wrote the sale, the trust, the guarantee revocation, the promissory note in Sandra's hands. Then the last paragraph, a direct quotation in block capital letters with its date. Don't let her do that. We're too close now. Her words, her electronic correspondence printed in Glenn's hand found behind a headboard in my own guest room. Below the quotation, in my ordinary script, I taught you that family protects each other, Victoria. You taught yourself something different. I signed it, Dad. Not love, not a closing phrase of any kind. Just the name she had called me since she could speak, and which I am still, and which no document changes. I folded both letters and sealed each in a plain white envelope. I wrote their names on the fronts in my careful block print, the same hand I use when something needs to be read without ambiguity. The same hand I used on the labels of Dorothy's pill organizer. The same hand I had used on every repair log for 35 years. I held both envelopes for a moment. They were very light. What was in them was not. I put them in the top desk drawer, locked it, and put the key in my jacket pocket. Then I turned off the lamp. In the hallway upstairs outside Noah's door, left open by the inch he always leaves it, the orange nightlight on inside. The boy asleep on his side with the stuffed bear Dorothy had bought him in September. I stopped. On the wall above his dresser, in the red marker drawing he'd brought home from school 2 weeks ago, my house printed in letters that were large and slightly uneven and certain of themselves. The house in the drawing had 4 windows, a door in the middle, and a sun in the upper corner that took up roughly a third of the page. It looked exactly like the kind of house a person draws when they've never had cause to question whether one is permanent. 2 more days, 1 more document, 1 more piece to put in place. I went to my room and turned off the light. The closing documents for Briggs and Company timepieces were ready Wednesday morning. I put on a clean shirt. That was the only ceremony I permitted myself. I was at the shop by 8 before anyone else. I let myself in through the side door, the utility entrance I'd installed in 1994, the same one I'd used on a Tuesday evening 2.5 weeks ago that had changed the shape of everything that followed. I didn't turn on the main showroom lights, just the hallway junction switch, which cast enough light to navigate by without making the place look open. I walked the shop in that half-light. I've done this once before the morning I took possession in 1990 before I moved a single piece of furniture in before the first display case was installed. You walk it empty and you understand what you're working with. I walked it now with 35 years in it and understood something different. Every display case along the front wall. The walnut I'd cut myself, the joinery I'd gotten exactly right after 1 measurement error and a second attempt. The floor tiles from 1997, I'd laid them over a long weekend with a borrowed tile saw and a level I've kept in the workshop ever since. The ceiling I'd refinished in 2008 after a water line upstairs caused damage I refused to hand off to a contractor. The grandfather clock against the back wall, the Hamburg long case, 1881, still on consignment from an estate that never resolved wound by my hand every Tuesday morning for 33 years without missing a week. I stood in front of it and listened to it run. I went to the back office. My chair, my desk, the work lamp on the corner of the bench. The space where I had sat in the dark the night of October 14th, with a customer's watch ticking in front of me, listening to it, not knowing what to do next. I knew now. I pulled the door shut behind me when I left. I wasn't counting losses. I was taking inventory of what had existed here and acknowledging it properly before closing the case. That's how you finish a job correctly. You inspect the work before you put the cover on. Eddie arrived at 8:30. He looked at me the way he does when something is off, and he has decided to let me set the terms of the conversation. 22 years has taught him that much. He unlocked the register and started his opening checks without a word. I stopped at case 4. The Patek Philippe Calatrava, the 1963 piece consignment, the one we'd discussed on the very afternoon this had all begun. I looked at the bezel crystal, still slightly proud of the case edge on the left side, the same as it had been 3 weeks ago. The Patek Philippe in case 4, I said. The bezel crystal's still a little loose. Fix it before the new owners come in. Eddie looked over at it. I will, Mr. Briggs. I turned and extended my hand. He took it without hesitation. I held the handshake for longer than a standard one, long enough that he would understand it was something other than a handshake, and that I didn't have the words for what it actually was, and that he didn't need the words either. The name stays on the door, I said. He knew. He'd known before I said it, probably. I'd made that a condition of the sale on paper for a reason. That's the agreement, I said. Eddie looked at me steadily. The name stays on the door. We let go. He went back to his opening work. I went to the front door, took the shop key off my ring for the last time, set it on the counter and left through the front. There was nothing else to say that those exchanges hadn't said completely. Sandra's office at 11. Phil Connolly with the final closing package, the sale documentation, the transfer of title, the buyer's executed agreement with the staff continuity provisions intact. I read every page in order the way I read everything. Phil made a brief comment about the timeline. I said, I've never signed anything I haven't read twice. I'm not starting now. I turned to the last page when I was satisfied each one before it was correct, and I signed the final lines. $1,380,000 cash transaction. Title clean since 1990 and clean now. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Sandra turned her monitor toward me, the wire transfer confirmation on the screen. She looked up. Congratulations, Walter. Thank you, I said, for all of it. She nodded once, the kind of nod that means this is done, and it was done correctly. I went out to the truck and sat with the engine off for a few minutes. This morning, I had been the owner of a watchmaking shop on the main commercial street of Harlow Falls. This afternoon, I was the man who had built it and decided what happened to it. I thought those were meaningfully different things. I thought the second one was, in some way I couldn't entirely articulate better. On the way to Kessler Avenue, I drove past the front of the shop. The sign was unchanged. Through the glass, I could see Eddie at the counter with a customer, a woman examining something from one of the center cases. Eddie with the particular attentive patience of a man who genuinely enjoys this work. Nothing visible from the street indicated that anything had changed at 2:47 this afternoon. That was exactly how I wanted it. I had one more stop at Sandra's office, one more document to sign the last one. After that, every piece would be in its place. There are things a man builds that outlast him. This is not supposed to surprise anyone. That is precisely why you build them. Sandra had the trust documents laid out on her desk in 2 sets. When I returned to her office that afternoon, the original and the execution copy, every page tabbed. Every signature line flagged with a small yellow marker, the way she does when she's organized, something she wants to be sure goes correctly. She'd prepared these while we were working through everything else over the past 10 days, and she'd held them as I'd asked until the shop transaction was confirmed. An irrevocable trust is by its nature a permanent structure once executed. It cannot be undone by the person who creates it. This was precisely the point. The house on Ridgecrest Drive, with its assessed value and its 38 years of our lives inside it, would be transferred into a trust, held for the benefit of one person, Noah James Holloway, age 8, currently asleep most nights by 9 o'clock, with a stuffed bear his grandmother had bought him in September. Walter Briggs and Dorothy Briggs would retain a life estate, the legal right to occupy the property for the remainder of our lives, full and unconditional, with no ability for anyone to displace us from it. Victoria Briggs held no claim against the trust, could not petition the trust, and had no legal standing to contest it under standard estate law. Sandra Howell was named successor trustee, managing the asset on Noah's behalf until he turned 25. The IRS Form 709 Federal Gift Tax Reporting, required for transfers that exceed annual exclusion limits, was prepared and ready to accompany the execution. The lifetime exemption applied. There were no tax consequences. Sandra looked up from the documents. "Are you certain about all of this?" I looked at the signature lines on the execution copy. "I built the shop on my own terms," I said. "I built the house on my own terms. This is no different." I picked up the pen and worked through the flagged pages in order. When I was finished, Sandra signed as witness and trustee, and it was done. I drove home in the late afternoon October light, the gold and gray of it, that I have always associated with this particular time of year in this particular place. The quality of light that has come through my kitchen window every October for 38 years. Dinner was Noah's. He'd turned a school assignment into a comprehensive account of Pacific Northwest rainfall patterns, and he delivered it across the dinner table with the enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered that meteorology is actually interesting. Dorothy asked questions, real ones, not the kind you ask to occupy a child. I passed food and answered when Noah directed something at me and listened to both of them. A normal Wednesday dinner, the last normal Wednesday dinner, that things would be this particular weight of normal for some time to come. After Noah was in bed, Dorothy and I sat at the kitchen table. I told her about the trust. She listened to all of it. The structure, what it meant for the house, what it meant for Noah, what it meant for Victoria. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, Victoria's son. Yes, the child she left here while she went and planned all of this. Yes. Dorothy looked at the table. "Good," she said. "That's the right answer." She said it with the considered certainty of a woman who has thought carefully about what the right answer actually is and arrived at it fully, not reflexively. There was no anger in it. She had moved past anger. What she had instead was clarity, which is what Dorothy has always had when something demands it. I slid the sale confirmation across the table. The Meridian wire transfer. $1,380,000. She looked at the number. "You know it's worth more than they thought." "Glenn knows commercial real estate," I said. "He doesn't know watches. He didn't understand what the name was worth. What 35 years of a specific reputation on a specific street in a specific town actually adds to a figure." She nodded. Set the paper down. "What happens tomorrow?" I told her tonight I would meet with Ray, then the locksmith. By morning, all 3 exterior locks on the house would be changed. The front door, the back door, the workshop. New keys counted, logged, none of them on any ring that Victoria or Glenn had ever held. We would leave Ridgecrest Drive before 9 in the morning, take Noah to school on the way, and spend the day at Ray's house. The house would be empty when Victoria and Glenn arrived in the afternoon. Patricia Sims would be moving at first light with Caroline. That operation was hers to manage, and it would be underway before we left. Dorothy would need a bag packed by morning, not a large one. Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then she opened them. "All right," she said. She got up and went to the bedroom with quiet purpose to pack, I knew, efficiently and without fuss, which was exactly how she'd done everything difficult in our 38 years. I went to the workshop. The pocket watch was on the bench where I'd left it 2 nights ago, my father's Hamilton 1947. The mainspring I'd been meaning to address for 35 years. I'd cleaned the crown wheel at the last session. Tonight I needed to examine the going train under the loupe before I could estimate what the final restoration would require. I lifted the loupe and held it over the movement under the lamp. The train looked clean, the pivots seated correctly. The mainspring barrel would need assessment before reassembly, but the rest of it was closer than I'd expected. I could see exactly what the last session of work would need. Tomorrow, I thought, while other things were being resolved, while Patricia was driving down a street I'd never seen, while Ray was pouring coffee for a man who thought he was attending a business meeting, while 2 letters sat in a desk drawer waiting for the right hour, I would sit here and finally finish what had waited 35 years. But tonight, there was still one more thing that needed to be placed in position before morning. I put the loupe down. It was time to go meet Ray. The most dangerous moment in any repair process is just before you close the case. Everything is still exposed. One wrong movement and the entire mechanism fails. The Ironwood Cafe was quiet at 7 Wednesday evening. 2 other tables occupied the kind of low, midweek foot traffic, where a conversation doesn't need to be quiet to be private. Ray was already in the corner booth with coffee and the particular expression he gets when he has done what he said he would do and is waiting to confirm it. I sat down across from him. I took the sealed envelope from my jacket and set it on the table between us. It contained everything, the letter, the photographs, copies of every document, Patricia Sims's contact information and case number, a written summary of every step I had taken and in what order. "If anything goes wrong tomorrow," I said, "let this gets to Sandra Howell's office the same day. Her home number's on the top sheet if the office is closed." Ray looked at the envelope, set his coffee down. "Nothing's going to go wrong, I know, but I always read everything twice, Ray." A pause. He picked up the envelope and put it in his inside jacket pocket. "Then, buy you a coffee. Already paid." He nodded. That was all either of us needed to say about the contingency. He told me what he'd arranged. One of his retirement fund investment partners, a commercial property man named Devlin, who'd worked alongside Ray's pension group in Harlow Falls for 12 years, had extended a meeting invitation to Glenn Mercer through a third-party broker connection, an off-market acquisition opportunity, the kind of language that makes people in Glenn's position show up on time and stay engaged. Glenn had confirmed attendance at 10 o'clock Thursday morning by reply email that same afternoon. "A man like that doesn't walk out of a meeting halfway through," Ray said. "Too much of his ego's at stake. You have at least 2 hours." He said it the way a man says something he has assessed professionally, not hopefully. Ray spent 28 years making time-critical decisions in buildings that were actively failing. He understands the difference between the two. "Devlin knows to run long," he added. "He can stretch it to 3 if he has to. 3 hours. Patricia had said she could work with 2. 3 was better than I'd planned for. I drove to Ridgecrest Drive. Sam Burke arrived at 9:30, a locksmith I'd used twice before, the last time in 2019, when the workshop lock started sticking in cold weather. He's a compact man in his 50s who works with an economy of motion. I recognize no wasted steps, everything laid out before he starts, nothing picked up twice. He examined the existing hardware on the front door and made a brief sound that could have been approval. "Whoever installed the original hardware knew what they were doing," he said. That was me," I said. 1994. He looked at it once more. Solid choice for the era. He pulled his kit. He replaced all 3 entry points, front door, back door, side garage entrance, with grade 1 deadbolts, the commercial security standard solid brass internals. He handed me 3 sets of keys for each lock, 9 keys total each set on a separate ring. He did not ask why all 3 were being changed simultaneously at 9:30 on a Wednesday night. That's one of the things I've always appreciated about Sam Burke. $620 cash, no paperwork. The new locks sounded different from the old ones. A slightly shorter throw, a crisper catch when the bolt seated. I locked and unlocked the front door twice after he left, listening to the mechanism engage each time. Clean. Unambiguous. The kind of sound that means what it's supposed to mean. I set up the security camera near the front-facing electrical outlet, a compact motion-activated unit charged full. I positioned it at the angle Patricia had suggested when I'd asked her about documentation camera facing the entry, capturing the full width of the front door and the 3 feet of wall on either side of it. I opened the application on my phone and checked the feed. Sharp image wide coverage, audio sensitive enough to pick up a conversation from across the room. I set it to continuous recording mode, not motion only, and confirmed the storage was clear. I took the 2 white envelopes from my jacket pocket. I'd carried them from the desk drawer that afternoon, already sealed, names written on the fronts. I placed them on the wall directly opposite the front door at eye level for a person of average height walking in, centered on the bare section of wall between the entryway and the living room opening. One envelope read, Victoria. The one beside it read, Glenn. Both in my careful block print, exactly as I'd written them 2 nights ago by lamplight in the workshop. I checked the camera feed. Both envelopes visible, centered in the frame, fully legible from the angle the camera captured. Everything a person needed to see the moment they came through that door. I went to the laundry room at the back of the house. Raised the window 2 inches, enough for a hand, enough for leverage from outside. The kind of opening that reads as oversight to anyone who isn't looking for it. They would need a way in. I locked the front door with the new key, confirmed it was seated, and pulled it closed behind me. Dorothy was reading in bed when I got home. I stood in the doorway. Done, I said. She set the book down. Good night, Walter. I stopped outside Noah's room. The door was open its usual inch, the orange nightlight inside the boy on his side, the stuffed bear in the crook of his arm. On the wall above the small desk, the drawing from the week before, red marker on white paper, my house in the large, certain letters of someone who has not yet had reason to question whether a house stays. The fence posts, the sun in the corner, and the sky Noah had colored blue with a crayon, while telling me something devastating in the same tone he'd have used to describe what he'd eaten for lunch. He just hadn't learned not to say true things. I stood in that doorway and looked at him sleeping, and thought, I hope he never learns. I hope the world does not teach him that particular skill the way it taught his mother. I pulled the door nearly shut, went to the workshop. The pocket watch lay on the bench under the lamp, my father's Hamilton 1947, the last time I'd have a chance to look at it, before the day I intended to finally finish it. I lifted the loop. The going train was clean, the escapement correctly seated, the mainspring barrel ready. The work was there to be done, tomorrow, while Ray's meeting was running and Patricia was on Cedar Street, and the house on Ridgecrest Drive sat empty with 2 envelopes on the wall and a camera recording the front door. Tomorrow I would sit at this bench and put it right. Everything that could be placed had been placed. I set the loop down, turned off the lamp, went to bed. Thursday, October 30th, 2025. Dorothy and I left Ridgecrest Drive before 9. Ray had coffee ready. I cleared a section of his workbench and set up what I'd brought in a canvas bag: the examination lamp, the tools, and my father's pocket watch. The house in Harlow Falls was quiet, then the kind of quiet that settles in when everyone inside it is exactly where they're supposed to be. Ray's house sits on the west side of Harlow Falls, 2 miles from Ridgecrest, a converted craftsman that has accumulated 30 years of a bachelor's considered arrangement, tools hung on pegboard in the garage, a kitchen that works without being decorative bookshelves that have been added to without being reorganized. The workbench in his back room is where he does the kind of careful projects he's taken up in retirement furniture repair, small mechanical things, jobs that require patience and don't have to be finished by any particular hour. It was the right table for what I needed to do. Dorothy settled into the front room with her book. Ray moved around the house, doing what he does on winter mornings, unhurried, present, not requiring conversation. I put the lamp on Ray's bench and set the pocket watch under it. Opened the case. The mainspring was in place. I had installed it in the last hour before leaving the workshop. The one task I could finish before everything else had to be, and I checked the tension first. The measured resistance as it transferred through the train, the feel of it seated correctly against the barrel arbor. It was right. I moved to the pallet fork. At 9:45, a text from Ray's phone to mine. He was in the meeting room in another part of the building. Glenn is in. Meeting is running. I read it, turned the phone face down, picked up the loop. The pallet fork is one of the most precise components in a mechanical movement, the part that regulates the release of the escape wheel one tooth at a time, converting stored energy into measured time. Get its geometry even slightly wrong, and the entire rate of the watch will drift, or the mechanism will seize entirely. It requires attention that doesn't allow for distraction. I gave it exactly that. But underneath the attention as I worked, I was thinking about a pharmacy on Cedar Street, about a woman who had spent months figuring out how to mail a letter without being seen 3 attempts before the third one made it to the box. Each attempt requiring a specific convergence of opportunity, nerve, and timing. She had taken a disposable camera to a kiosk and paid in cash and photographed 4 pages of documents on a borrowed afternoon. She had memorized my phone number and kept it inside the spine of a book she'd owned since college because it was the one object in that house she was confident Glenn would never open. She had used my words I had said to her in a different context, in a different decade, to justify to herself why she couldn't stay silent. I had told her, if a mechanism is broken, and you know it's broken, and you do nothing that isn't patience, that's negligence. She'd held on to that long enough to act on it. In the most difficult circumstances, I can imagine she had been more precise than I would have been. I checked the pallet entry jewel under the loop. The contact surface looked clean. I moved to the draw angle. At 11:23 in the morning, my phone screen lit up on Ray's bench. Patricia Sims, text message. She's out, she's safe, documents secured. I set the loop down. I read the message twice. I put the phone face down on the bench. Then I sat with both hands flat on the surface of Ray's workbench, the lamp still running above me, and I did not move. I'm not going to describe at length what those 7 words meant to me, or what went through my mind in the minute or so that I sat there. Some things that happen inside a person belong to that person and don't require an audience. What I can tell you is that I sat still for a while, with my hands flat on the bench and the lamp on and the pocket watch open in front of me, and I thought about a 9-year-old who asked me why the clock hand doesn't go backward, and a letter folded into 3 parts and carried to a mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon, and a boy asleep in an orange-lit room with a drawing of his house on the wall. And then I picked up the phone. I typed, "Thank you," sent it. 3 words. I set the phone face down again. I picked up the loop and went back to the draw angle on the pallet fork. The work was there to be done. Sometimes the most appropriate response to something that has resolved correctly is to continue the work in front of you. Dorothy appeared in the doorway sometime around noon. She looked at me. I looked up from the loop and gave a single nod. She held my gaze for a moment, then went back to her book. 38 years. We have learned to be efficient with the things that don't require words. Ray made sandwiches at 1 o'clock, and we ate in the kitchen without discussing what had happened or what was coming. The afternoon passed. I finished the pallet fork inspection and began reassembly of the escapement, the component relationship I had been building toward across every session, the part that would determine whether the watch kept accurate time or didn't. The hands had been removed for cleaning. The dial sat beside the movement on a clean piece of cloth. At 4:30, I checked the camera application on my phone. The feed from the Ridgecrest Drive front entry came up immediately, sharp image the interior of the front hallway, visible in the late afternoon light coming under the door. And there on the wall, exactly as I'd placed them Wednesday night, the two white envelopes. Victoria. Glenn. My careful block print, both names fully legible in the camera frame, exactly centered. Motion detection armed. Battery still at 100%. No triggered events recorded since I'd set the camera and left. I checked the timestamp 4:31 p.m. Victoria's text to Dorothy, the one from over 3 weeks ago, at the kitchen table. While I'd been standing at the refrigerator thinking about something else entirely, had said they'd land around 3 home before 5. The drive from the airport to Harlow Falls ran 40 minutes in ordinary traffic, longer if they stopped, which meant they were either already in Harlow Falls or minutes away. I set the phone face down on the bench, went back to the movement. The mainspring, the train, the calibrated escapement, 35 years of meaning to finish this, and it was nearly there. One more session, one more hour against the lamp. At 5:14 p.m., the phone screen lit up again. Motion detected. I picked it up. Before I show you what happened when they walked through that door, I need one thing from you. Type clock in the comments. Just that one word. It tells me you've stayed, you've paid attention, and you understand why a clockmaker always reads everything twice. What you're about to see took Walter 19 days to build. It takes less than 5 minutes to fall apart. One more note: portions of this story contain fictional elements crafted for storytelling purposes. Names, places, and certain details are not drawn from any specific source, but the lesson underneath all of it is worth sitting with. I was not there. I had said everything that needed saying in ink on paper with my name at the bottom. Whatever happened next was going to happen without me in the room. The camera would show me the rest. 5:17 p.m. I was sitting at Ray's workbench with the pocket watch open in front of me when the motion alert fired. I opened the camera application and watched the feed come up on the small screen. The image was sharp and steady. The interior of my front hallway, 2 white envelopes centered on the wall directly opposite the door. The late October light coming faint under the gap at the sill. A car pulled into the drive. Glenn's. They got out on the same side of the frame and moved toward the front door in the manner of people who have decided in advance how something is going to go. Glenn, with 2 bags from the trunk. Victoria with her phone and her bag, both of them carrying the forward posture of people arriving to collect something they believe is theirs. I held the phone with both hands and watched. Victoria reached the front door first. She had the spare key I'd given her last year. The one I'd handed her over the kitchen table told her it was for emergencies, meant it. I watched her find it in her bag and insert it into the lock. She turned it. Nothing. She tried again, adjusting the angle. The key was in the correct lock, correctly inserted. It simply didn't fit anymore. She looked at it. Glenn stepped up beside her. He took the key and tried it himself with the particular focused efficiency of a man who doesn't immediately accept information that contradicts his expectations. Same result. He looked at the hardware, crouched, slightly examined the faceplate and the keyway. He knew what he was looking at before he said anything. I could see it in how he held still for a moment. New hardware, Glenn said. His voice came through the camera audio with slight compression, but clearly enough. Victoria started to respond. That doesn't... Brand new, installed today. He disappeared around the corner toward the back. He was gone for about 2 minutes. When he came back, he said something I couldn't fully catch from the audio, but I could read the shape of it. 3 entry points, all changed. Victoria had her phone out. I watched the call come to my phone, sitting face up on Ray's bench beside the lamp. Glenn's name on the screen. I did not answer. It rang through to voicemail. He called again immediately. Voicemail again. Dorothy's phone across Ray's front room buzzed on the side table. She looked at it and turned it face down without expression. Glenn went back around the side of the house. He'd found the laundry room window the 2-inch gap I'd left. He worked the window up the rest of the way and reached through to release the interior latch, then pushed it fully open. He helped Victoria through first her jacket caught for a moment on the window casing, and she dropped into the laundry room. Then he came through behind her, and a moment later I heard the back door open from the inside. They moved through the house in the direction of the front entry. I knew they were coming before the camera picked them up. I could track their progress by the sound on the audio. The particular heel and toe of two people moving with purpose through a space they were trying to assess quickly. Then they came into frame. They stopped. Both of them stopped completely in the middle of the front hallway. 2 white envelopes on the wall in front of them at eye level with their names in block capitals. The camera was positioned precisely. The envelopes were precisely where I'd placed them. There was nothing else on that wall and nothing else to look at. Victoria picked up her envelope. She worked the flap open carefully, her hands visible on the small screen, not entirely steady, and took out the letter. She read it the way someone reads something they are hoping in the first seconds will turn out to be something other than what it clearly is. Glenn picked up his envelope. He read differently, faster, skimming ahead, the way a person in business learns to do when they're looking for the number, the bottom line, the sentence that tells them how bad it is. He moved through the first paragraph and the second. Then he slowed. I knew which line he'd reached. I had written it deliberately in plain language with no preamble. Caroline is no longer at your house, Glenn. She is safe. You will hear from her attorney by Monday morning. I watched him stop moving. He stood completely still on that camera screen for a moment. A man who has built a plan around a fixed set of assumptions, encountering in 8 words the confirmation that one of the load-bearing assumptions has been removed. He looked at the letter. Then he looked at the stack of pages clipped behind it. He pulled the pages free and began going through them. He moved quickly at first, then slowed. The 16 printed pages, the ones I'd found behind the nightstand in the guest room, the ones he'd been convinced for 2 months, were sitting in a drawer at his office. I could tell from the change in his posture the exact moment he recognized what he was holding. He had spent weeks accounting for risks, identifying variables, closing gaps. He had not accounted for the gap between a headboard and a wall. Victoria was reading the final section of her letter. I had left the address of the page for last, the direct quotation in block capitals with the email date. I watched her reach it. I watched her read her own words in my handwriting. Don't let her do that. We're too close now. She stood still for a moment. He sold it. Her voice was flat with none of the inflection she'd used in every phone call and every visit and every cup of coffee at the kitchen table for the past 3 weeks. He actually sold it, Glenn. Glenn didn't respond. He was pressing numbers on his phone, his attorney, I assumed. 5:30 p.m. on a Thursday. No answer. He tried 2 more numbers. Nobody picked up. Victoria looked at the 16 pages in his hand. Something in her face shifted, not breaking, not collapsing, but reorganizing around a new understanding of what had happened. You printed them, she said, not accusing exactly, stating. And you left them in the guest room. Glenn said something I didn't catch on the audio. Victoria didn't respond to whatever it was. The space between them in that hallway, which I could see on a 2-inch screen from across Harlow Falls, was doing something that happens in the late stages of any failed operation. The 2 people who were a unit were becoming visibly 2 separate problems with 2 separate losses. Glenn was dealing with the legal exposure he couldn't reach his attorney about. Victoria was dealing with something else with the evidence in her hands. of what she had known and not said, and what it was going to cost her in a ledger that had nothing to do with money. She walked away from him through the front room, stopped at the bay window. She stood there with her back to the camera, looking out through the glass at the front yard, the lavender bed, the driveway, the street in the 5:30 October evening, everything ordinary and unchanged outside the window of a house she had not managed to get her hands on. Across the street, Barbara Holt was on her porch, tending a window box planter, her back half turned to the street. She glanced over once, then went back to her plants. Victoria stood at the window. I watched her from Ray's living room on a small screen, the examination lamp still running behind me on the workbench, the pocket watch open on the cloth beside the lamp. She wasn't calculating anything. I could see that much even from this distance and angle and resolution. For the first time in the 19 days since I'd stood in the dark hallway of my own building and heard her voice through a speakerphone, she did not look like a woman with a plan. She looked like a woman who had stopped. I turned the phone face down on Ray's bench. 5 minutes later, it rang again. Not the camera application. A call. From Dorothy, who was in Ray's front room, 20 feet away. I picked up on the first ring. Her voice was quiet. Victoria just called me. I've kept things running correctly for 35 years. A watch, a business, a family, in the best way I knew how. The work doesn't always come out the way you imagined it, but if you do it correctly at the end, the mechanism holds. I asked Dorothy what Victoria had said. She said she didn't know you would do all of this. Dorothy held the phone in her lap, looking at it with the expression of a woman who has had enough time to arrive at exactly where she is standing. She said she didn't think you were capable of it. What did you tell her? Dorothy looked up at me. I told her your father spent 35 years learning that every mechanism has a point of failure, Victoria. He found yours. A brief pause, the kind that belongs to someone who has finished saying what they wanted to say. Then I hung up. I sat with that for a moment. It was the most precise thing anyone had said in the entire length of this. How are you, Dot? She stood. Making tea. Come inside when you're ready. We left Ray's house before 7. He walked us to the car, poured each of us one last coffee into travel cups that he refused to let us argue about, and stood on the front step with his hands in his pockets while we backed down his driveway. He raised one hand as we turned onto the street. 30 years of friendship contained in one gesture. I raised mine back. The drive to Ridgecrest Drive took 6 minutes. The neighborhood was in its ordinary Thursday evening, pattern lights on in kitchens, a dog being walked on the far end of the block. The wet October street reflecting the street lamps in the particular way it does from late October through March, which is to say most of the year. I parked in my spot, the third space from the entrance, the same one I've used since 1997 at a shop that I no longer own out of habit, that doesn't require a reason. The house was as I'd left it. No sign of disturbance beyond what I'd arranged: the laundry window I'd have to relatch in the morning, the new locks I'd need to add to Dorothy's keyring. The front hallway was quiet. The wall opposite the door was bare where the 2 envelopes had been. I stood in the entry for a moment and looked at that wall. Blank. Even. Exactly as it had been for all the years before Wednesday night. And as it would be from here forward. Dorothy made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Victoria had poured her own coffee since she was 17, where Noah worked on his school drawings, where I had sorted Dorothy's medications every Sunday for 3 years, where I had sat the morning after October 14th and understood that I would not flinch from what needed to be done. 2 cups. 38 years of marriage will make some conversations redundant, not because nothing needs to be said, but because the cup of tea is already saying it. My phone vibrated on the table beside my cup. Unknown number, but the area code was local, the exchange near the east side of Harlow Falls. I felt the breath catch once and let it go. I picked up the phone and opened the message. Dad, it's me. I'm okay. I'm safe. I'll call Sunday. See. I read it once. Read it again. Then I typed back 6 words. I know. Sunday. Sent. I slid the phone across the table to Dorothy. She read it without picking it up, looked down at it, read both messages, the incoming and the reply. Then she set it down between us. She picked up her tea. She didn't say anything, and she didn't need to, and I was glad she didn't, because there wasn't a word in the English language that would have added anything to those 7 words from a phone number I didn't recognize on a Thursday evening in October. After dinner, I went to the workshop. Noah's stuffed bear was on the couch in the living room. He'd be home in the morning, back to his homework and his colored pencils and the reliable, ordinary weight of a school week. The workshop lamp was still on from when I'd left in the morning. The pocket watch was on the cloth where I'd set it before we'd gone to raise. I sat down at the bench. The movement was complete escapement calibrated pallet fork, correctly seated mainspring installed and tensioned correctly. What remained was the dial and the case. I lifted the dial carefully with both hands. Enamel face the original, not a replacement, preserved intact through 60 years in a drawer by virtue of being in a case that had sealed well enough to keep the dust out. I held it under the lamp at an angle and examined the surface. One hairline mark near the 6 o'clock position that had been there before I'd touched anything and which would stay. Everything else was unblemished. I set it into position over the movement, pressing it gently until the dial feet seated in their holes. I placed the hands, hour, minute, second, each one seated on its shaft, and pressed flat with the setting tool, no force beyond what the mechanism requires, which is very little if the part is correctly centered. Then I lowered the case back, aligned it, and closed the snapback with the pressure of my thumb until it seated with a clean, definite click. The same click it would have made in 1947 when it left the factory. The case was whole again. I held the watch in my left hand and wound it. The crown turned under my thumb with the particular small resistance of a spring being drawn tighter with each quarter turn. The resistance building gradually and evenly, the way a correctly tensioned mainspring always does. I wound it until the resistance told me to stop. I released the crown and set it. The second hand moved. A clean, step-by-step sweep, steady, regular, without hesitation. 60 years of silence in a drawer, and now this, the quiet, insistent tick of a thing doing precisely what it was built to do. I held it in my palm and listened to it. The sound was small. It was enough. I set the watch down on the bench beside Noah's drawing, the one he'd brought home from school, my house, in red marker. The fence and the sun and the sky he'd colored blue while telling me something devastating in the most ordinary voice. The watch and the drawing. Both of them the right age, both of them still running. Outside, Harlow Falls continued its Thursday evening, the traffic on the wet streets. The last of the October light gone completely now. The Pacific Northwest dark. Settling in the way it does in the last days of the month, thorough and unhurried, the kind of dark that commits. I sat at the bench in the workshop light and listened to the watch tick. Walter Briggs, 68 years old, $1,380,000 in an account that belongs to no one but me. A house in an irrevocable trust for a boy who draws his home in red marker and asks the right questions. A daughter safe and free for the first time in 2 years. A shop on the main street of Harlow Falls with the right name on the door and the right man behind the counter. And a watch that had been waiting 35 years for someone to sit down and do the work properly. The second hand moved, steady, precise, forward, exactly as it was built. These are the kind of grandpa stories that don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly in the form of a light left on in a back office and change everything. Like all grandpa stories, this one doesn't have a perfectly clean ending. Caroline called on Sunday. We talked for 2 hours. Some things in a family come back. We are still finding out which ones do. I've shared this family story because someone out there needs to hear it, not to admire how I handled things I didn't enjoy a single day of it. I am a clockmaker who spent 68 years trusting the people closest to him without ever checking the mechanism. That cost me. Learn from it before it costs you. The lesson is simple. Know what you own. Know what you've signed and read every document twice before your name goes on it. Don't be like me waiting for a light in a back office to tell you something was already wrong, long before that night. I lean on something I heard long ago in a church pew in this same town. God gives a man a mind, and using it is his own responsibility. I believe that more now than I did before October. This family story doesn't fit on a greeting card. Most of the ones that matter don't. This is also a family story about what it means to protect the people you love, even from the people you love. If these grandpa stories stay with you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you haven't already. Every story on this channel exists because of people like you who stay until the end. Thank you, truly. Going forward, some stories on this channel contain fictional elements built for educational purposes. If that's not the content for you, step away, find what fits, and take good care of yourself.